On February 24th, 2022, as Russian forces crossed Ukraine's borders on multiple fronts and missiles struck Kyiv, American intelligence officials reportedly offered Ukraine's president an evacuation from the capital. His response became one of the most quoted lines of the entire war. He didn't need a ride, he needed ammunition. Volodymyr Zelensky, a former television comedian who had played a fictional Ukrainian president before becoming an actual one, stayed in Kyiv while a man who had spent 2 decades consolidating absolute control over the largest country on earth tried to remove him by force. Vladimir Putin expected this war to last days. He believed Zelensky's government would collapse, that Ukrainian resistance would crumble, and that he would be remembered as the leader who restored Russian dominance over territory he had never accepted as truly independent. None of that happened. This is the story of how an actor and an autocrat ended up deciding the fate of European security in the 21st century. Volodymyr Zelensky was born in 1978 in Rivalry, a heavily Russian-speaking industrial city in southeastern Ukraine, to a Jewish family in what was then still the Soviet Union. He trained as a lawyer but found his actual calling in comedy and entertainment, building a career as a performer, producer, and eventually the creator and star of a wildly popular television show called Servant of the People, in which he played a humble history teacher who accidentally becomes president of Ukraine after a viral video of him ranting about corruption goes viral. The show was a genuine cultural phenomenon, satirizing Ukraine's notoriously corrupt political class with a sharpness that resonated deeply with a population exhausted by oligarchic dysfunction. In 2019, in one of the strangest and most direct examples of fiction informing reality in modern political history, Zelensky actually ran for the real presidency of Ukraine using the same party name as his fictional television party and won in a landslide against an incumbent widely seen as ineffective and compromised. He arrived in office with no prior political experience, considerable skepticism from career diplomats and Western officials, and a public persona built entirely around comedy and performance rather than statesmanship. Almost nobody, including many Ukrainians, expected him to become the wartime figure he became. Vladimir Putin's path could not have been more different. Born in 1952 in Leningrad to a working-class family that had survived the brutal Nazi siege of that city during the Second World War, Putin grew up steeped in stories of Soviet sacrifice and resilience that would shape his worldview for the rest of his life. He joined the KGB, served as an intelligence officer in East Germany during the final years of the Cold War, and watched the collapse of the Soviet Union from Dresden in 1989, with what he later described as a profound sense of loss and humiliation. A formative experience that scholars of Putin consistently point to as central to understanding his later political project. He rose through the chaotic Russian political system of the 1990s with a combination of bureaucratic competence, intelligence connections, and a willingness to project the kind of stability that an exhausted Russian population, traumatized by a decade of economic collapse and lawlessness, found genuinely appealing. He became president in 2000 and spent the following 2 decades systematically dismantling Russia's nascent democratic institutions, consolidating media control, eliminating meaningful political opposition, and rebuilding a security state that increasingly resembled the Soviet system he had served in his youth. He developed an ideology, articulated with increasing explicitness over the years, that Ukraine was not a genuinely separate nation, but an artificial construct carved out of Russia's historical territory, a belief that would ultimately drive him toward war. The world these two men collided in was shaped by 3 decades of unresolved tension following the Soviet collapse. Ukraine had become independent in 1991 with the rest of the Soviet republics, but its relationship with Russia remained deeply contested, complicated by a large ethnic Russian and Russian-speaking population in the east and south, by Ukraine's strategic position as a buffer between Russia and NATO, and by competing visions of whether Ukraine's future lay with European integration or continued alignment with Moscow. The 2014 Maidan Revolution, which ousted a pro-Russian Ukrainian president following mass protest against his rejection of a European trade deal, triggered Russia's annexation of Crimea and a prolonged, low-intensity war in eastern Ukraine's Donbass region that killed thousands over the following 8 years without ever fully resolving the underlying conflict. By the time Zelensky took office in 2019, Ukraine was a country at war with Russian-backed separatists, deeply divided over its national identity, and caught in a geopolitical position that made it one of the most strategically consequential pieces of territory in the world. Zelensky entered office, hoping, with what many critics considered naive optimism, that he might actually be able to negotiate an end to the Donbass conflict through direct diplomacy with Putin. He pursued this goal through 2019 and 2020 with genuine sincerity, meeting with Putin in person and pushing for peace negotiations that ultimately produced no meaningful breakthrough. Putin, watching a comedian-turned-president attempt to negotiate the fate of what he considered fundamentally Russian territory, appears to have concluded that Zelensky represented weakness rather than a genuine diplomatic opportunity. Through 2021, as Russia began massing troops along Ukraine's borders in numbers that Western intelligence agencies increasingly warned represented preparation for full invasion rather than mere pressure tactics, Putin escalated his rhetoric about Ukraine's illegitimacy as an independent state, publishing a lengthy essay arguing that Russians and Ukrainians were fundamentally one people artificially divided by historical accident. Zelensky, facing intelligence warnings from Western allies that many Ukrainians initially found difficult to fully believe, attempted to balance public reassurance against the genuine risk of a war that seemed, to many observers right up until it began, almost too large and too consequential for any rational leader to actually launch. The invasion that began on February 24, 2022, was intended, according to extensive post-war analysis of Russian planning, to achieve a rapid decapitation of the Ukrainian government within days, with Russian forces advancing on Kyiv, expecting minimal resistance and the collapse of Zelensky's administration. Russian airborne forces seized Hostomel Airport near Kyiv on the first day of the war, specifically to enable a rapid airlift of forces into the capital. The plan assumed Zelensky would flee, that Ukrainian military resistance would be limited and disorganized, and that a pro-Russian government could be installed within a matter of days. Zelensky's decision to remain in Kyiv, filmed in nightly addresses from the besieged capital wearing military green rather than a suit, became the single most consequential public relations decision of the war's opening phase. It transformed him almost overnight from an untested wartime leader of uncertain capability into a globally recognized symbol of national resistance, and it galvanized both Ukrainian military morale and Western political support in ways that fundamentally altered the war's trajectory before the fighting itself had even been decided on the battlefield. The Ukrainian military, reorganized and partially retrained since 2014 with substantial Western assistance, fought the initial Russian advance to a standstill around Kyiv within weeks, forcing a Russian withdrawal from the capital region by early April 2022 that represented a catastrophic failure of the war's original objective. What followed was a grinding, attritional conflict across eastern and southern Ukraine that bore little resemblance to the rapid decisive victory Putin had clearly anticipated, instead settling into a war of artillery, fortified positions, and enormous casualties on both sides that more closely resembled the First World War than the swift modern campaign Russian planning had assumed. The aftermath of the war's opening phase reshaped both men's positions in ways neither had anticipated. Zelensky became one of the most recognized political figures in the world, touring Western capitals to secure military aid, addressing parliaments and the United Nations, and sustaining a level of international support for Ukraine that exceeded almost anyone's expectations from before the invasion. He faced enormous pressure managing a war effort dependent on continued Western military and financial support, navigating the political complexities of sustaining that support over years rather than the weeks Putin had originally planned for. Putin, facing a war that had badly damaged Russia's military reputation, triggered unprecedented international sanctions and produced staggering Russian casualties that Russian state media worked hard to obscure from the domestic public. Doubled down rather than reconsidering his fundamental position, framing the conflict increasingly as an existential struggle against Western encroachment, rather than the limited operation his own planning documents suggest he originally anticipated. What the Zelensky-Putin rivalry reveals is something genuinely significant about the unpredictable relationship between institutional power and individual character in moments of crisis. Putin possessed every conventional advantage going into this confrontation: a vastly larger military, decades of experience consolidating and exercising power, an intelligence apparatus that had spent years analyzing Ukrainian politics and military capability. Zelensky possessed almost none of the conventional credentials that geopolitical analysts typically associate with successful wartime leadership. What he possessed instead was a communicator's instinct for the moment, built ironically from years spent performing rather than governing, and a willingness to stay physically present in a capital that conventional military logic suggested he should have fled. The war's actual battlefield outcomes were decided by soldiers, weapons, and logistics, rather than by either man's personal qualities. But the war's early trajectory and the international response that shaped everything that followed was decided substantially by a single choice made in the first hours of the invasion: whether to leave or to stay. History rarely allows such a clean test of whether character matters as much as conventional power. In the opening days of this war, it did. And the answer it produced surprised almost everyone who had spent careers studying power for a living.